For the most part, when the Europeans were arriving, they were following the resources that best worked for them. Now, just to pause, geographers use the definition of resources as what human beings determine is valuable to human culture. Now, we sometimes set aside and say natural resources, but we don't really call them resources unless they work for us, something that we can glean. And you know, in the intersection of cultures, sometimes one culture values something and the other culture comes in and says, well, that's worthless. You know, like in the encounters between European property ownership and indigenous concepts of property ownership. Europeans say, well, that's silly. You have no ownership, you have no proof of property. And the Native Americans say, that's silly. You can't own land. You are a part of it. But those concepts will clash, and in those clashings and integration, they change. But human beings will wind up with a set of resources that tends to be important regardless of more specific cultural values. We all got to have water, and there is a set of plants and animals we got to have, and there is a utility found in sets of metals and minerals. As the indigenous folks before the Europeans were finding those areas and those places for their settlement and development, so the Europeans did as well when they arrived. Clicker, go back one. Well, we'll leave it there. So you find, again, locations were there because of particular physical attributes they might find helpful. Geographers use the term site, which means that's what's there. It's occurring there, regardless of the manipulation that previous cultures might have had. And situation is the network, the connections to other places. So settlement would be chosen based on what they see there in that site, naturally, what can be utilized, and so what do you do with it? So, for example, Scots-Irish would settle in the Ozarks and says, that's great. We can grow a little corn, we can run some hogs, we can harvest some timber, we can do that, we can do a little mining, we can do a little bit of that, and they'll find everything. And the Germans say, yeah, but you got to have soil and you got to have a river to get your produced goods out of it. You know the story of the three little pigs? You know that story, right? Scots-Irish, build your house out of sticks. Germans, build your house out of bricks. You know, that's the concept there. The Germans had a sense of permanence. We're going to build structure and hierarchies, have trade relationships. We're going to have a variety of skills. And the Scots-Irish are saying, everybody's got those skills. Just go out and do it. Harvest acorns when you need to, or dig up tiff when you need to. That's do whatever is what you can do, and mix and make. To live on the edges. Why paint your barn? You're just going to have to paint it again. The Germans say, no, we paint the barn because that's control of our environment. That's a statement of ownership. That's organizing the chaos when you get that barn painted. And Scots-Irish leave stuff laying around because you never know when you're going to use that. The Germans put it away, clean it, and don't lend it. You know, less for a fee. We'll do that. But all of those choices wind up becoming imprints on the culture that we still experience today. And somewhat of those prejudices that may emerge, so when you think of the Ozarks, then that's sort of expendable. But the rivers and the cities on the rivers, those are worth protecting. So even built into our own senses today about value in the resources connects back to folks' self-understanding. But all of it subject to change. When climate patterns vary, differing soil conditions, different sets of plants and animals, when human beings intervene, we can make shifts and changes. Now, again, think of Missouri. There were times when the metals and the minerals became very important to European settlement. What brought the Spanish initially up here? Silver. Of course, they didn't find any, but found a lot of lead. And then it was the French that got the lead out. The French came in, were able then to harvest that, see it as a marketable commodity, and begin to build that whole thing. Now, lead mining is about to disappear in Missouri today as the last part of the viburnum trend begins to probably be over with. But think of how the landscape has been transformed by the harvesting of lead as a resource. Or think of here in central Missouri, the coal that was taken out clear up until the 1960s, and tremendous transformation of the landscape because that resource was valued by that culture in terms of its marketing and utilization. Or clay. Remember a few years ago, I was walking in some backyards in Versailles, Missouri. That's how we say it in Missouri, like they did in Kentucky. And a guy says, "See that pit out in my backyard? That clay made bricks to line the Panama Canal." And as a reminder, oh yeah, the tremendous power and utility of harvesting clay, now it gets in the way of my gardening. But in a previous experience, that was the refractories that made and produced, and we still have quality fire brick produced in Missouri. But again, a resource that was valuable, harvest it, get it manufactured. Limestone and granite, zinc and tiff, and we still find those things in the earth that become so important. And settlement then orients around that, builds around that, and again creates a sense of place based on harvesting those particular resources. Now, when the Europeans came, at first, the river lowlands were among the most appealing to the original settlers. It gave them then soils that could be used. It gave them access to the rest of the world. But there was that love-hate relationship with the floodplain that began early in those times. If you live in the floodplain, what's going to happen one of these days? It will remove you. The river will own the riverbed, but the human beings still trying to counteract against it and saying, well, we're not going to leave, we'll rebuild. Well, that was going on with the very first European settlements in the floodplains, and it's still going on today, is it not? I suspect 50 years from now it will still be going on, trying to, again, establish that relationship with the river lowlands. Later European settlement then began to find the hills and the plains, going up to the dissected hill plains of the north, spreading out toward the Osage plains, but now a different relationship to the land. They're grasslands and rolling hills, and thinking now of cultivation where you don't have to remove timber, and being able to graze then herds and have that relationship. Then the Ozarks, the upland woods being harvested then for wildlife, for metals and mineral, and for timber. Specialties began to occur in Missouri. I don't want to push the point too hard, but you tended to find initially the French occupation being more concerned about trapping initially, trading and mining, Scots-Irish diversity in subsistence, German agriculture, industry, both urban and rural, then African slavery, particularly supporting where we call here in mid-Missouri Little Dixie, having the highest proportion of African slaves, not large plantation economies, but smaller numbers of African slaves, all dependent upon native removal. And now Missouri has that dubious, how many Indian reservations do we currently have in Missouri? Right. It's something to be, embarrassed about, guilty about, but some would take pride. But once you get those folks out of the way, plenty of room then for your cultures to take over and change again the built environment.